Hey Reddit, I'm not usually the type to air my dirty laundry in public, but I really need to get this off my chest. So here it goes. My wife, let's call her Jane, has always been kind of a high-maintenance type. We've been married for about 8 years, and while we don't have any kids, I thought we had a pretty solid relationship. Boy, was I wrong. Jane works downtown and started using a rideshare service to get to and from work about a year ago. At first, I didn't think much of it. She said it was more convenient than the bus and less stressful than driving herself. Plus, it wasn't like we were struggling with money, so I figured why not? She ended up getting the same driver pretty often. His name was Mike, and she'd occasionally mention him in passing. "Mike is so funny," she'd say. Or, "Mike told me about this great new restaurant." I didn't think much of it. People talk to their drivers, right? After a while, though, I noticed she started coming home later than usual. "Work's been crazy," she'd say. "Lots of overtime." I believed her because why wouldn't I? But then there were nights when she'd come home smelling like a bar or a club, all dressed up like she'd been out partying. When I asked her about it, she'd laugh it off. "Oh, just some after-work drinks with the girls," she'd say. Then there were the lies. Little things at first, like saying she was at a meeting when her phone showed she was somewhere else. Or she'd claim she had to work late, but her office wasn't picking up the phone. I started feeling like I was living with a stranger. But every time I confronted her, she'd get hysterical, accusing me of not trusting her, of trying to control her. It was exhausting, so I let it go. Looking back, I realized I was blind to what was happening right in front of me. But when you love someone, you trust them, right? Anyway, things took a turn for the worse when Jane started going on these business trips. She'd be gone for a few days at a time, claiming she had to attend conferences or meet clients out of town. She'd come back with cheap souvenirs and stories that didn't quite add up. But again, she had an answer for everything. One night she came home late, reeking of alcohol. She was a mess, her clothes all disheveled, makeup smeared. I helped her to bed, and that's when her phone buzzed. I couldn't resist looking. It was a message from Mike. "Had a great time tonight, can't wait to see you again." I felt my stomach drop. I didn't want to believe it, but there it was, staring me in the face. I confronted her the next morning, and she flew into a rage, accusing me of spying on her, invading her privacy. She denied everything, of course, said Mike was just a friend, but something in her eyes told me she was lying. That was the moment I knew. I had to find out the truth. So I started keeping a closer eye on her, tracking her movements, checking her phone when I could. I didn't want to believe she was cheating, but I needed proof, and I was determined to get it. After that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. Jane kept insisting that everything was fine, but I knew better. I started doing some digging. I didn't want to be that paranoid husband, but I couldn't ignore the signs anymore. One evening, I decided to follow her. She said she was going out with the girls again, so I waited until she left and then grabbed my keys. I tailed her car from a distance, trying to stay inconspicuous. My heart was pounding the whole time, but I needed to know the truth. She drove to a fancy restaurant downtown, and I parked a few blocks away. I watched from a distance as she got out of the car, and sure enough, there was Mike, the Uber driver. They hugged, and she kissed him on the cheek. My stomach churned, but I needed more proof. I followed them into the restaurant, keeping my distance. They were seated at a cozy little corner table, laughing and talking like old friends. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but the way they looked at each other was enough. It was clear that they were more than just friends. I snapped a few pictures on my phone, feeling like a detective in some bad TV drama. It felt wrong, but I needed evidence. After they finished dinner, they left the restaurant and got into Mike's car. I followed them again, and this time they drove to a motel on the outskirts of town. I parked a safe distance away and watched as they went inside. My heart sank. I didn't need to see any more. I had all the proof I needed. I drove home in a daze, my mind racing. How could she do this to me? When Jane came home later that night, she was her usual bubbly self, acting like nothing was wrong. I didn't confront her right away. I needed to think about my next move. I knew this wasn't going to be easy, but I couldn't just let her get away with it. Over the next few days, I started gathering more evidence. I checked her phone when she wasn't looking, finding more texts from Mike, and even some pictures. It was like a punch to the gut every time. I also reached out to a lawyer to get some advice on what to do next. Then came the day that everything blew up. Jane had another one of her business trips planned, and I decided it was time to catch her in the act. I took the day off work and followed her to the motel again. This time, I wasn't alone. I brought a friend with me as a witness, just in case things got ugly. We parked outside the motel and waited. Sure enough, Mike's car pulled up, and Jane got out. They went inside, and we followed quietly, staying just out of sight. We waited for a few minutes, giving them time to get settled, and then I burst into the room. There they were, right in the middle of it. Jane and Mike, caught red-handed. Jane screamed and tried to cover herself, but it was too late. I had all the proof I needed. I took a few more pictures for good measure, then turned to leave. Jane was hysterical, screaming at me, calling me all sorts of names, but I didn't care. I was done. I went straight to my lawyer's office with the evidence. It was time to file for divorce. This was just the beginning of a long and painful process, but I was ready. I wasn't going to let her walk all over me anymore. After I filed for divorce, things got pretty tense at home. Jane tried to act like nothing had changed, but I wasn't having any of it. I couldn't even look at her without feeling sick. She kept trying to apologize, saying it was just a mistake, but I knew better. This wasn't a one-time thing. She'd been sneaking around with Mike for months, maybe even longer. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. I moved into the guest bedroom and started looking for a new place to live. Jane, being the manipulative person she is, tried to make things difficult. She'd scream and cry, begging me to forgive her, then turn around and accuse me of ruining her life. It was like living with a stranger. One day I came home from work to find Jane and Mike in our living room. I couldn't believe the nerve. They were sitting there, drinking wine like they owned the place. Jane had this smug look on her face, like she was daring me to do something about it. I lost it. I told Mike to get the hell out of my house, and that if he ever set foot in there again, I'd call the cops. Mike left, but Jane just laughed. She said something about how I'd never have the guts to follow through with the divorce, that I'd come crawling back to her. I walked out, needing to clear my head. I couldn't believe what my life had turned into. I started spending more time with my friends, trying to distract myself from the mess at home. They were supportive, but I could tell they were worried about me. I wasn't eating much, wasn't sleeping well. I just wanted the whole thing to be over. One night, I got a call from my lawyer. He had some news about the divorce proceedings. Apparently, Jane had been trying to contest it, claiming I had no grounds for divorce. It was laughable, considering the mountain of evidence I had against her. But that was Jane for you, always trying to twist things to her advantage. We had our first court date, and it was a nightmare. Jane showed up with her lawyer, looking all put together and innocent. She tried to play the victim, saying I was controlling and jealous, that I'd driven her to seek comfort elsewhere. But the judge wasn't buying it. I presented all the evidence I'd gathered, and it was pretty clear who was at fault. Jane flew into a rage, screaming and crying right there in the courtroom. She accused me of ruining her life, of being a monster. I just stood there, numb. It was like watching a train wreck in slow motion. The judge had to call for a recess to calm things down. After that, things moved pretty quickly. The judge ruled in my favor, and the divorce was granted. I got to keep the house, which was a small victory, but it didn't feel like much. Jane moved out, and I started trying to piece my life back together. But it wasn't over yet. Jane was still out there, and she wasn't done making my life hell. So, after the judge ruled in my favor and Jane moved out, I thought things would start to settle down. I was wrong. Jane didn't take the divorce well. She was furious, and her true colors came out even more. She was hell-bent on making my life as miserable as possible. It started with little things. She'd show up at the house unannounced, claiming she needed to get something she'd left behind. Every time she'd take something minor, but it was really about trying to rattle me. One day it was a sweater, another day it was a book. I tried to stay calm, but it was hard. Then she started spreading lies about me. She told our mutual friends that I'd been abusive, that I'd driven her into Mike's arms. Some people believed her, and I lost a few friends over it. But the ones who really knew me stood by my side, thank God. They knew what kind of person Jane was. One night, I was having a beer with my buddy Tom when I got a text from Jane. "I need to talk to you. It's urgent." I ignored it. A few minutes later, she called. I let it go to voicemail. Then she started texting nonstop. "You have to listen to me. I'm outside your house. Open the door." Tom looked at me, concerned. "Do you want me to go with you?" he asked. "Nah, I'll handle it," I said, but I was dreading whatever drama Jane was about to bring. When I got home, there she was, sitting on the porch steps. She looked disheveled, her makeup smeared like she'd been crying. I didn't buy it for a second. "What do you want, Jane?" I asked, keeping my distance. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice shaky. "It's important." "Make it quick," I replied, not in the mood for her games. "I'm pregnant," she blurted out, tears streaming down her face. I stood there, stunned. This was the last thing I expected. "How do I know it's mine?" I asked, my voice cold. "You've been sleeping with Mike." "It's yours," she insisted. "I haven't seen Mike since we split." I didn't believe her, but part of me couldn't help but wonder, what if she was telling the truth? What if this baby was mine? I felt like I was trapped in a nightmare. "I need time to think," I said finally. "I'll call you tomorrow." She left and I sat there trying to process everything. Could Jane really be pregnant? And if she was, what did that mean for me? I didn't want to be tied to her for the rest of my life, but if it was my child, I couldn't just walk away. The next day I called her and told her we needed to get a paternity test. She agreed, but not without a lot of drama. "You don't trust me?" she cried. "I'm carrying your child, and you're treating me like a liar." But I stood my ground. We scheduled the test, and the waiting began. Those weeks were some of the longest of my life. I tried to focus on work, on rebuilding my life, but the uncertainty was always there, hanging over me. Finally, the day came. I got the call from the clinic. "Mr. Smith, the results are in. You are not the father." I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I called Jane to tell her the news. She didn't take it well. She screamed at me, called me every name in the book, and then hung up. But I didn't care. I was free. Or so I thought. But Jane wasn't done with me yet. After the paternity test proved I wasn't the father, I thought that would be the end of Jane's attempts to drag me back into her chaos. But I underestimated just how vindictive she could be. A few weeks later, I started getting strange calls at work. They were from unknown numbers, and whenever I picked up, no one would say anything, just silence, or sometimes I'd hear someone breathing. It was creepy, but I tried to ignore it. I figured it was just a prank, or maybe Jane trying to mess with me. Then the emails started. Someone created fake accounts and began sending me all sorts of nasty messages. They accused me of horrible things, said I was a terrible husband, a liar, a cheater. I knew it was Jane behind it, but proving it was another matter. I saved all the messages, thinking I might need them as evidence. One evening, I got home to find my car had been keyed. Deep, ugly scratches all along one side. I was furious. I called the police, but there wasn't much they could do without witnesses or security footage. My neighbor mentioned seeing a woman who looked like Jane lurking around earlier, but that wasn't enough to take action. Things escalated when Jane started showing up at my work. She'd hang around the parking lot, waiting for me to come out. She'd scream at me, causing a scene in front of my colleagues. It was embarrassing and stressful. I had to talk to my boss and explain the situation. Thankfully, he was understanding and allowed me to work from home for a while. One night, there was a loud banging on my front door. I looked through the peephole and saw Jane, looking wild-eyed and disheveled. She was yelling, demanding to be let in. "I need to talk to you," she screamed. "You can't ignore me forever." I didn't open the door. Instead, I called the police. They arrived quickly and escorted her away, but she wasn't arrested. She was given a warning and told to stay away from me. I hoped that would be the end of it, but Jane wasn't done yet. A few days later, I got a call from my lawyer. Jane had filed a lawsuit against me, claiming I had stolen money from her during our marriage. It was a ridiculous accusation, and we both knew it, but it meant more legal battles, more stress. My lawyer assured me we could fight it, but it was going to be a long, drawn-out process. Around this time, I started seeing a therapist. I needed someone to talk to, someone who could help me make sense of all the chaos. It helped a lot, having someone to vent to, someone who could offer advice. My therapist suggested I file for a restraining order against Jane. I hadn't wanted to go that route, but it was clear I had no choice. So I did. I gathered all the evidence I had, the threatening emails, the vandalism, the harassment at my workplace. We went to court, and after hearing everything, the judge granted the restraining order. Jane was ordered to stay away from me, my home, and my workplace. For a while, things were quiet. Jane seemed to have finally backed off, but I knew her well enough to not let my guard down completely. I kept the security cameras I'd installed, stayed in touch with my lawyer, and kept seeing my therapist. And just when I thought I might be able to start moving on with my life, another curveball came my way. So things were quiet for a bit after I got the restraining order against Jane. I started to feel like I could finally breathe again. I focused on my work, spent time with friends, and even started thinking about dating again. I knew it would take a while to trust someone new, but I was ready to put myself out there. But, as you can probably guess, the peace didn't last long. One morning I woke up to find a letter on my doorstep. No stamp, no return address, just a plain white envelope. I opened it and found a typed letter from Jane. She wrote that she was sorry for everything, that she still loved me, and that she couldn't live without me. She begged me to take her back, saying she'd do anything to make things right. I was shocked. How had she managed to get this letter to my house without me noticing? I checked the security footage, and sure enough, there she was in the dead of night, slipping the envelope under my door and then running off. I saved the footage as more evidence, just in case. I didn't respond to the letter. I knew better than to get sucked back into her drama. But Jane didn't stop there. Over the next few weeks, I started finding little gifts left on my doorstep. Flowers, chocolates, even a stuffed animal with a note that said, "I miss you." It was creepy and unsettling. I called my lawyer again, and he advised me to document everything and report it to the police. So I did. The police took my report, but said there wasn't much they could do unless Jane actually violated the restraining order by coming near me. It was frustrating, but I understood their hands were tied. One night, I was out with some friends, trying to have a good time and forget about all the craziness. We were at a bar, having a few drinks, when I noticed a familiar face in the crowd. It was Mike, the Uber driver. He saw me too, and he walked over with a smirk on his face. "Well, if it isn't the ex-husband," he said, leaning against the bar. "How's life treating you?" I felt a surge of anger but tried to keep my cool. "What do you want, Mike?" "Just wanted to say hi," he said, his smirk widening. "Heard about the restraining order. Jane's been pretty upset about it. I couldn't believe the nerve of this guy." "Stay out of my business," I said, trying to stay calm. "You've done enough damage." Mike just laughed. "Relax, man. I'm not here to cause trouble. Just thought you should know, Jane's not the type to give up easily." With that, he walked away, leaving me fuming. It was a reminder that Jane wasn't done with me yet, and I needed to stay vigilant. A few days later, I came home to find my front door slightly ajar. My heart started racing. I knew I'd locked it before I left. I called the police immediately and waited outside until they arrived. When they went in, they found that my house had been ransacked. Drawers were pulled out, furniture was overturned, and my belongings were scattered everywhere. I felt violated. Someone had been in my home, my sanctuary. The police took a report and started an investigation, but I had a sinking feeling that Jane was behind it. There was no sign of forced entry, which meant she might have had a key. I changed the locks immediately. The following week was a blur of police reports, insurance claims, and trying to put my house back in order. I was on edge, jumping at every little noise, constantly checking the security cameras. I felt like I was living in a nightmare. And just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, I received another letter. This time, it wasn't from Jane. It was from her lawyer, claiming that she was suing me for emotional distress and defamation. She accused me of ruining her reputation and causing her unbearable suffering. I couldn't believe it. After everything she'd put me through, now she was trying to turn the tables and make me the bad guy. It felt like a cruel joke, but I knew I had to take it seriously. I met with my lawyer to discuss the new lawsuit. He assured me that we had a strong case and that Jane's accusations were baseless, but it was still another layer of stress I didn't need. We prepared for another legal battle, gathering all the evidence we could to defend against her claims. And as if that wasn't enough, there was one more twist to the story. After getting the letter about Jane suing me for emotional distress and defamation, I felt like I was living in a bad movie. I couldn't believe she had the audacity to drag me through more legal battles after everything she'd done. But I knew I had to stay strong and fight back. My lawyer and I went through every piece of evidence we had. We prepared a solid defense, showing the court all the harassment, vandalism, and lies Jane had subjected me to. I knew it wasn't going to be easy, but I was determined to see it through. The first court date was set, and I walked into that courtroom feeling a mix of anxiety and determination. Jane was there with her lawyer, looking smug and confident. It made my blood boil, but I kept my composure. Her lawyer started with a sob story, painting Jane as the innocent victim who had been wronged by a controlling and abusive husband. It was hard to listen to, knowing how much of it was fabricated. But when it was our turn, my lawyer presented all the evidence we had collected. The emails, the security footage, the police reports, it was all there. Jane tried to play the victim, bursting into tears and claiming I was lying, but the judge wasn't swayed. After a long day in court, the judge ruled in my favor, dismissing Jane's lawsuit. It was a huge relief, but I knew it wasn't over. Jane wasn't the type to give up easily. After the court case, I hoped things would finally calm down. But Jane had other plans. She started showing up at places she knew I'd be. My favorite bar, the grocery store, even the gym. It felt like she was stalking me, trying to intimidate me or make me uncomfortable. I kept documenting everything, but it was exhausting. One night, I came home to find a note taped to my front door. It was another letter from Jane, but this one was different. It wasn't a plea for forgiveness or a threat. It was a warning. She wrote that she was done playing nice and that I'd regret ever crossing her. It sent chills down my spine. I called the police again, but without direct evidence of a threat, there wasn't much they could do. They advised me to stay vigilant and keep documenting everything. I installed more security cameras around my house and even got a security system installed. Then one evening, I came home to find my car had been vandalized again. This time, it was more than just scratches. The windows were smashed, and the tires were slashed. It was a clear message from Jane. I called the police and filed another report, but there were no witnesses, no fingerprints, nothing to tie it directly to her. I felt like I was losing my mind. I couldn't go on living like this, constantly looking over my shoulder, wondering what Jane would do next. I decided it was time to take more drastic measures. I met with my lawyer, and we discussed getting a more comprehensive restraining order that would cover more than just my home and workplace. We went back to court and presented all the new evidence: the continued harassment, the vandalism, the letters. The judge granted the new restraining order, which included a no-contact clause and extended to any place I frequented. It felt like a small victory, but I was still on edge. For a while, things were quiet again. Jane seemed to have finally gotten the message, or so I thought. I started to relax a little, focusing on rebuilding my life. I even went on a few dates, trying to move forward. But then one night, there was a knock on my door. I looked through the peephole and saw 2 police officers. My heart sank. I opened the door, and they told me they needed to talk to me about Jane. She had been found unconscious in her apartment, an apparent overdose. I was stunned. I didn't know what to say. They asked if I had any idea why she might have done it, if she'd said anything to me recently. I told them about the harassment, the court cases, the restraining orders. They took notes and thanked me for my time, saying they'd be in touch if they needed more information. As I closed the door, I felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, guilt, sadness. I didn't want anything bad to happen to Jane, despite everything she'd done, but I couldn't help feeling like this was another twist in the never-ending saga of our messed-up relationship. After the police visit, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Jane's overdose was a shocking turn of events, and while I didn't want her to come to any harm, I couldn't ignore the relief I felt at the thought that this might finally be the end of her harassment. A few days later, I got a call from the hospital. Jane had regained consciousness and was asking to see me. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to go, to see if she was okay and to get some closure, but another part of me was wary, knowing how manipulative she could be. I decided to go, but I brought a friend with me for support. When we arrived at the hospital, Jane looked fragile and pale, a far cry from the confident, manipulative woman I'd come to know. She glanced at my friend and then at me, her eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry," she whispered. I didn't know what else to do. I felt a pang of sympathy, but kept my guard up. "Jane, you can't keep doing this. You need help." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I know. I'm going to get help. I promise." I didn't know if I could believe her, but I hoped she was sincere. "Good. It's the best thing for you." We talked for a while, and she admitted to everything. The stalking, the vandalism, the fake lawsuit. It was like a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. She apologized profusely, and while I wasn't ready to forgive her, I felt a sense of closure. I left the hospital feeling a strange mix of emotions. Relief that Jane was getting help, sadness for what had happened to her, and hope that I could finally move on with my life. For a while, things were peaceful. Jane checked into a rehab facility, and I focused on rebuilding my life. I started dating again, met a wonderful woman named Emily, and things were going well. I felt like I could finally put the past behind me. But then, one evening, I got a call from Jane's mother. Jane had checked herself out of rehab early and had gone missing. She was frantic, asking if I'd heard from Jane or if I knew where she might be. I hadn't, and the news sent a chill down my spine. A few days later, Jane showed up at my doorstep. She looked worse than ever, gaunt, disheveled, and clearly not in a good state of mind. She begged me to let her in, saying she had nowhere else to go. My heart ached for her, but I knew I couldn't let her back into my life. "I'm sorry, Jane, you need to go back to rehab. I can't help you." She became hysterical, screaming and crying, accusing me of abandoning her. I called the police and they took her away, but it was a heartbreaking scene. I knew she needed help, but I also knew I had to protect myself. A few days later, I got another call from Jane's mother. Jane had been admitted to a psychiatric facility for intensive treatment. She apologized for everything and assured me that Jane was in good hands. I felt a sense of relief but also sadness for what had become of her. Emily was incredibly supportive through all of this. She helped me stay grounded and reminded me that I deserved to be happy. With her encouragement, I focused on moving forward and building a new life. But just when I thought things were finally settling down, I received a letter in the mail. It was from Jane's lawyer, informing me that Jane was contesting the divorce settlement, claiming she was entitled to more of our assets due to her emotional distress. I couldn't believe it. After everything, Jane was still trying to make my life difficult. I contacted my lawyer, and we prepared to fight back. The legal battle was draining, but I was determined to see it through. In the midst of all this, Emily and I grew closer. She was my rock, and I knew I could count on her. We started talking about the future, and I began to see a light at the end of the tunnel. The news that Jane was contesting the divorce settlement hit me hard. It felt like a never-ending cycle of drama and stress. I couldn't understand why she couldn't just move on and let me do the same, but I knew I had to fight back and protect what was rightfully mine. My lawyer and I started preparing for the new legal battle. We gathered all the evidence we had from the previous court cases, the restraining order, and the ongoing harassment. It was exhausting, but I was determined to see it through. Meanwhile, Emily was my constant support. She encouraged me to stay strong and reminded me that we were in this together. Her presence in my life was a beacon of hope amidst all the chaos. The day of the court hearing arrived, and I walked into the courtroom with a mix of anxiety and determination. Jane was there, looking more composed than I had seen her in a long time. Her lawyer argued that she deserved a larger share of our assets due to the emotional distress she had suffered. It was hard to listen to, knowing how much of that distress she had brought upon herself. When it was our turn, my lawyer presented our case clearly and concisely. He highlighted all the evidence of Jane's harassment, the false accusations, and the vandalism. The judge listened carefully, and after a long day in court, he ruled in my favor once again. Jane's claim was dismissed, and the original divorce settlement stood. I felt a huge sense of relief. It was finally over, or so I thought. Jane looked defeated, but I knew better than to let my guard down completely. For a while, things were peaceful. Jane stayed in the psychiatric facility, receiving the treatment she desperately needed. Emily and I continued to grow closer, and we started talking about our future together. I felt like I was finally getting my life back on track. One day, Emily and I were having lunch when I received a call from Jane's mother. She sounded distraught. Jane had escaped from the facility and was missing again. My heart sank. I knew this wasn't over yet. That evening, as Emily and I were sitting on the couch, there was a loud knock at the door. I looked through the peephole and saw Jane looking more unhinged than ever. She was shouting, demanding to be let in. "Open the door, John! We need to talk!" she screamed, pounding on the door. Emily called the police while I tried to reason with Jane through the door. "Jane, you need to leave. This isn't helping anything. But she wouldn't listen. She kept screaming, and the situation was escalating. The police arrived quickly and took her away. But the whole ordeal left me shaken. I knew I couldn't keep living like this. Jane needed more help than I could ever give her, and I needed to protect myself and Emily. I decided to take more drastic measures to ensure our safety. I talked to my lawyer about relocating and getting a new identity to make it harder for Jane to find us. It sounded extreme, but given everything that had happened, it felt like the only way to truly move on. Emily was supportive of the idea. She wanted us to have a fresh start, free from the shadows of the past. We began making plans to move to a different city, away from all the memories and the drama. As we prepared for the move, I couldn't help but feel a sense of sadness. I never wanted things to turn out this way. I had loved Jane once, and seeing her unravel like this was heartbreaking. But I knew it was the only way to protect myself and the people I cared about. Just as we were about to finalize our plans, I received another call. This time, it was from the police. Jane had been found and was in critical condition. She had tried to take her own life. I felt a mix of emotions: anger, sadness, and a deep sense of helplessness. I knew I couldn't save Jane, but I also couldn't ignore the part of me that still cared about her. The call from the police about Jane being in critical condition hit me hard. Despite everything she had done, I didn't want her to come to any harm. I knew she needed help, and I hoped this time she would get the support she needed. I went to the hospital to see her. She was unconscious, hooked up to various machines, and looked so fragile. It was heartbreaking to see her like that. I spoke to the doctors, and they told me it was touch and go. Jane had taken a massive overdose, and it was a miracle she was still alive. As I stood there looking at her, I couldn't help but reflect on how things had gotten so out of control. We had once been happy, but now our lives were a mess. I felt a deep sense of sadness and regret. The next few days were tense. Jane was in and out of consciousness, and the doctors weren't sure if she would pull through. I stayed in touch with her mother, who was devastated, but grateful that I was there. Emily was incredibly supportive, understanding my need to be there for Jane despite everything. Eventually, Jane started to stabilize. When she was well enough to talk, I went to see her. She was weak and frail, but there was a flicker of recognition in her eyes when she saw me. "John," she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "I'm so sorry for everything." I sat down beside her, taking a deep breath. "Jane, you need to focus on getting better. We both need to move on from all of this." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I know. I'm going to stay in treatment this time. I promise." I hoped she meant it. I wanted to believe she could turn her life around, but I knew it wasn't going to be easy. We talked for a while, and I could see the pain and regret in her eyes. It was clear she was struggling, and I hoped she would finally get the help she needed. After leaving the hospital, I felt a strange sense of closure. I knew I had done everything I could to help Jane, and now it was up to her to take the next steps. Emily and I continued with our plans to move, wanting to start fresh in a new place. We found a cozy house in a different city, far away from all the memories and drama. It felt like a new beginning, a chance to rebuild our lives without the constant fear of Jane showing up. The move was stressful, but it was also liberating. I felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. I felt a huge sense of relief. It was finally over, or so I thought. Jane looked defeated, but I knew better than to let my guard down completely. For a while, things were peaceful. Jane stayed in the psychiatric facility, receiving the treatment she desperately needed. Emily and I continued to grow closer, and we started talking about our future together. I felt like I was finally getting my life back on track. One day, Emily and I were having lunch when I received a call from Jane's mother. She sounded distraught. Jane had escaped from the facility and was missing again. My heart sank. I knew this wasn't over yet. That evening, as Emily and I were sitting on the couch, there was a loud knock at the door. I looked through the peephole and saw Jane, looking more unhinged than ever. She was shouting, demanding to be let in. "Open the door, John! We need to talk!" she screamed, pounding on the door. Emily called the police while I tried to reason with Jane through the door. "Jane, you need to leave. This isn't helping anything." But she wouldn't listen. She kept screaming, and the situation was escalating. The police arrived quickly and took her away, but the whole ordeal left me shaken. I knew I couldn't keep living like this. Jane needed more help than I could ever give her, and I needed to protect myself and Emily. I decided to take more drastic measures to ensure our safety. I talked to my lawyer about relocating and getting a new identity to make it harder for Jane to find us. It sounded extreme, but given everything that had happened, it felt like the only way to truly move on. Emily was supportive of the idea. She wanted us to have a fresh start, free from the shadows of the past. We began making plans to move to a different city, away from all the memories and the drama. As we prepared for the move, I couldn't help but feel a sense of sadness. I never wanted things to turn out this way. I had loved Jane once, and seeing her unravel like this was heartbreaking. But I knew it was the only way to protect myself and the people I cared about. Just as we were about to finalize our plans, I received another call. This time it was from the police. Jane had been found and was in critical condition. She had tried to take her own life. I felt a mix of emotions, anger, sadness, and a deep sense of helplessness. I knew I couldn't save Jane, but I also couldn't ignore the part of me that still cared about her. The call from the police about Jane being in critical condition hit me hard. Despite everything she had done, I didn't want her to come to any harm. I knew she needed help, and I hoped this time she would get the support she needed. I went to the hospital to see her. She was unconscious, hooked up to various machines, and looked so fragile. It was heartbreaking to see her like that. I spoke to the doctors, and they told me it was touch and go. Jane had taken a massive overdose, and it was a miracle she was still alive. As I stood there looking at her, I couldn't help but reflect on how things had gotten so out of control. We had once been happy, but now our lives were a mess. I felt a deep sense of sadness and regret. The next few days were tense. Jane was in and out of consciousness, and the doctors weren't sure if she would pull through. I stayed in touch with her mother, who was devastated but grateful that I was there. Emily was incredibly supportive, understanding my need to be there for Jane despite everything. Eventually, Jane started to stabilize. When she was well enough to talk, I went to see her. She was weak and frail, but there was a flicker of recognition in her eyes when she saw me. "John," she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "I'm so sorry for everything." I sat down beside her, taking a deep breath. "Jane, you need to focus on getting better. We both need to move on from all of this." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I know. I'm going to stay in treatment this time. I promise." I hoped she meant it. I wanted to believe she could turn her life around, but I knew it wasn't going to be easy. We talked for a while, and I could see the pain and regret in her eyes. It was clear she was struggling, and I hoped she would finally get the help she needed. After leaving the hospital, I felt a strange sense of closure. I knew I had done everything I could to help Jane, and now it was up to her to take the next steps. Emily and I continued with our plans to move, wanting to start fresh in a new place. We found a cozy house in a different city, far away from all the memories and drama. It felt like a new beginning, a chance to rebuild our lives without the constant fear of Jane showing up. The move was stressful, but it was also liberating. I felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. One day, I received a call from the hospital. Jane had woken up. She was weak and disoriented, but she was alive. Her parents were relieved, and so was I. I went to see her, hoping to find some closure. When I arrived, Jane looked up at me with tears in her eyes. "John, I'm so sorry for everything." "I know," I said, sitting down beside her, "but you need to focus on getting better now." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I will. I promise." I left the hospital feeling a sense of closure. Jane was getting the help she needed, and I could finally move on with my life. Emily and I focused on our wedding plans, excited for our future together. But just when I thought the drama was finally over, another unexpected twist came our way. After Jane woke up from the coma and apologized, I hoped that would be the end of the drama. Emily and I continued to focus on our wedding plans, trying to leave the past behind. Things were looking up, and we were genuinely happy. But then, out of the blue, I received a letter in the mail. It was from Jane's lawyer. Apparently, Jane was claiming that I owed her a substantial amount of money from our divorce settlement, citing emotional distress and the costs of her medical treatment. I couldn't believe it. After everything, she was still trying to drag me back into her mess. I contacted my lawyer, and we started preparing for yet another legal battle. It felt like I was living in a nightmare, unable to escape Jane's grasp. Emily was incredibly supportive, but I could see the strain it was putting on her too. We went back to court, and it was exhausting. Jane's lawyer argued that I was responsible for her condition, that I'd caused her emotional distress and driven her to her actions. It was hard to listen to, knowing how much I had already been through because of her. My lawyer presented our case, showing all the evidence of Jane's harassment, the restraining orders, and the false accusations. It was clear that Jane was trying to manipulate the situation to her advantage. After a long and grueling process, the judge ruled in my favor once again, dismissing Jane's claims. I felt a huge sense of relief, but it was bittersweet. I didn't want to keep fighting these battles. I wanted to move on with my life and focus on my future with Emily. We decided to speed up our wedding plans, eager to start the next chapter of our lives. The wedding day arrived, and it was perfect. Emily looked stunning, and I felt like the luckiest man in the world. Surrounded by our friends and family, we exchanged vows and promised to support each other no matter what. It was a beautiful day, filled with love and happiness. For a while, life was blissful. Emily and I settled into married life, enjoying our time together and planning for the future. We talked about starting a family, buying a house, and all the things that come with building a life together. But just when I thought we were finally free of Jane's influence, I received a call from her mother. Jane had gone missing again. She had checked herself out of the psychiatric facility and disappeared without a trace. Her mother was frantic, asking if I had any idea where she might be. I didn't. But the news left me feeling uneasy. I couldn't help but worry about what Jane might do next. I hoped she wouldn't come after me or Emily, but I knew I had to be prepared for anything. A few weeks later, I came home to find a note taped to the front door. It was from Jane saying she needed to see me one last time. She wrote that she had something important to tell me and that it couldn't wait. My heart sank. I didn't want to see her, but I knew I had to find out what she wanted. I met her at a nearby park, making sure to keep it a public place. When I arrived, Jane looked tired and defeated. She handed me a letter and told me to read it. Then, without another word, she walked away. I opened the letter and started reading. Jane had written a detailed account of everything she had done, admitting to all the lies, the harassment, and the manipulation. She apologized for everything, saying she was finally ready to take responsibility for her actions. She wrote that she was leaving town for good and that she hoped I could find happiness with Emily. I felt a mix of emotions, relief, sadness, and a strange sense of closure. I hoped Jane meant what she said and that she would finally get the help she needed. I went home and showed the letter to Emily, who hugged me tightly and reassured me that we could finally move on. Life started to feel normal again. Emily and I continued to build our life together, enjoying the peace and happiness we had worked so hard to achieve. But deep down, I knew I would always be wary, always looking over my shoulder, wondering if Jane would ever come back. After receiving Jane's letter and her promise to leave town for good, I felt a glimmer of hope that we might finally have some peace. Emily and I focused on our life together, and for a while, things were genuinely good. We bought a new house, one that we could truly call our own, free from the shadows of the past. Emily and I started talking seriously about starting a family, and it felt like we were finally on the right path. Then, one evening, I received a call from an unknown number. It was a private investigator hired by Jane's parents. Jane had gone missing again, and they were desperate to find her. They asked if I had heard from her or seen her. I hadn't, but the call left me feeling uneasy. The next few days were tense. Emily tried to keep my spirits up, but I could tell she was worried too. Just as we were beginning to settle into our new life, the past was creeping back in. One night, as we were having dinner, there was a loud knock on the door. I looked through the peephole and saw 2 police officers standing on the porch. My heart sank. I opened the door, and they asked if they could come in. They told us they had found Jane. She had been staying at a motel a few towns over and had been arrested for trespassing and disorderly conduct. The police found her with a suitcase full of letters addressed to me. They handed over the suitcase, and I felt a mix of dread and sadness. Inside were dozens of letters, all written by Jane. Some were apologies, others were angry rants, and some were just incoherent ramblings. It was clear she was struggling with her mental health, but I couldn't let her drag me back into her chaos. I took the letters to my lawyer and discussed what we should do next. He advised me to get another restraining order and to document everything. It felt like we were back to square one, but I knew I had to protect myself and Emily. A few days later, we were granted a new restraining order, and Jane was sent back to the psychiatric facility. Her parents assured me they were doing everything they could to help her, and I hoped this time it would stick. Emily and I tried to move on once again. We started planning a trip, hoping a change of scenery would help us clear our minds and refocus on our future. We chose a quiet cabin in the mountains, far away from the city and all the drama. The trip was perfect. We spent our days hiking, exploring the beautiful landscape, and talking about our dreams. It felt like we were finally able to relax and enjoy each other's company without the constant fear of Jane's interference. But just as we were beginning to feel truly at peace, we received a call from the police. Jane had escaped from the facility again, and this time she was considered a danger to herself and others. They advised us to be cautious and to report any contact from her immediately. The news was a crushing blow. It felt like no matter what we did, we couldn't escape Jane's shadow. Emily and I talked about what to do next. We considered moving again, even further away, but it felt like running would only be a temporary solution. Then, something unexpected happened. I received a call from Jane herself. She sounded desperate and scared. She begged me to meet her, saying she had something important to tell me. I was hesitant, but I knew I had to hear her out. I met Jane at a public park, with the police aware of the meeting just in case. When I saw her, she looked worse than ever, gaunt, disheveled, and clearly struggling. She handed me a letter and told me to read it. The letter was a confession. Jane admitted to everything she had done, all the lies, the manipulation, the harassment. She wrote that she was tired of running and that she needed help. She apologized for everything and begged for forgiveness. I felt a wave of emotions: anger, sadness, pity. I knew Jane needed help, but I couldn't be the one to save her. I told her she needed to go back to the facility and stick with her treatment. She nodded, tears streaming down her face, and promised she would. The police took Jane back to the facility, and I hoped this time she would stay and get the help she needed. Emily and I returned to our cabin, trying to find some semblance of peace. As we sat by the fire that night, Emily took my hand and said, "We'll get through this, together." I nodded, feeling a sense of hope. We had been through so much, but I knew we could overcome anything as long as we had each other. After the encounter with Jane and her return to the psychiatric facility, Emily and I tried to find a sense of normalcy again. The trip to the cabin helped us reconnect and reminded us of the strength of our bond. We returned home determined to focus on our future. Life began to settle down, and we started making plans for the next chapter. Emily and I decided to start trying for a baby, and the excitement of potentially expanding our family brought a new sense of joy and purpose. A few months passed without incident. Jane's parents kept me updated on her progress, and it seemed like she was finally getting the help she needed. I was hopeful that this time she would stick with her treatment and move on with her life. One evening, as Emily and I were preparing dinner, I received a call from Jane's mother. She sounded hopeful and told me that Jane had been making significant progress in her treatment. She had been attending therapy sessions regularly and was showing signs of genuine improvement. "I think she's finally on the right path," Jane's mother said. "She wanted me to thank you for your support and to let you know she's truly sorry for everything." I felt a sense of relief wash over me. It seemed like Jane was finally finding her way. I thanked her mother for the update and wished them all the best. A few weeks later, I received a letter from Jane. This time, it wasn't filled with apologies or accusations. It was a sincere and heartfelt letter, thanking me for the role I had played in her life and acknowledging the pain she had caused. She wrote about her progress in therapy and her plans to start a new life once she was discharged. "I know I've hurt you in ways that words can't fix," she wrote, "but I'm working on becoming a better person. I hope one day you can forgive me." I didn't know if I could ever fully forgive Jane, but I appreciated the gesture. I showed the letter to Emily, and we both felt a sense of closure. It was time to fully move on and embrace our future. Our lives continued to improve. Emily and I found out we were expecting a baby, and the news filled us with happiness and excitement. We started preparing for the arrival of our little one, decorating the nursery and picking out names. One afternoon, I received another call from Jane's mother. This time it was different. She sounded urgent and asked if we could meet. I agreed, and we arranged to meet at a nearby CAF GC. When I arrived, Jane's mother looked anxious. She explained that Jane had been discharged from the facility and was doing well, but she had received some unsettling news. Mike, the Uber driver who had been involved in Jane's affair, had been released from prison and was trying to contact Jane. He's been calling her, sending her messages, she said, her voice trembling. I'm worried he might try to drag her back into the chaos. My heart sank. Just when things were starting to get better, another potential threat loomed on the horizon. I assured Jane's mother that I would do everything I could to help keep Jane safe, and that we needed to inform the authorities about Mike's actions. Emily and I discussed the situation, and we decided to take extra precautions. We installed additional security measures at our home and made sure Jane's parents were doing the same. I contacted my lawyer and the police to inform them of Mike's attempts to contact Jane. A few days later, I received a call from the police. They had tracked Mike's movements and issued a restraining order against him, preventing him from contacting Jane or coming near any of us. It was a relief, but I knew we had to stay vigilant. With Mike's threats seemingly under control, we focused on the upcoming arrival of our baby. Emily and I were determined to create a safe and loving environment for our child, free from the drama and chaos that had plagued our past. As we prepared for the birth, we received another letter from Jane. She wrote that she was aware of Mike's attempts to contact her and that she had taken steps to protect herself. She thanked me once again for my support and assured me that she was committed to her recovery. I'm stronger now, she wrote. I won't let him drag me down again. It felt like we were finally reaching the end of this long, painful journey. Emily and I focused on our future, eagerly awaiting the arrival of our baby and the new life we were building together. The months leading up to the birth of our baby were filled with a mix of excitement and anxiety. Emily and I prepared as best as we could, and the anticipation of welcoming a new life into our family brought us closer together. Despite the lingering shadows of the past, we focused on the future and the joy that awaited us. The day finally arrived, and Emily gave birth to a beautiful baby girl. We named her Grace, and she brought an overwhelming sense of love and happiness into our lives. Holding Grace in my arms for the first time, I knew that everything we had been through had led us to this moment. Emily and I were over the moon, and we couldn't wait to start this new chapter as parents. Life settled into a new rhythm, and we embraced the challenges and joys of parenthood. Jane's presence in our lives seemed to fade as she focused on her recovery and rebuilding her own life. We received occasional updates from her parents, and it seemed like she was truly making progress. I hoped that she would find peace and happiness. One afternoon, about a year after Grace was born, I received a surprise visitor at my office. It was Jane. She looked healthier, more composed, and there was a sense of calm about her that I hadn't seen before. John, I just wanted to thank you, she said, her voice steady, for everything, for being there, even when I didn't deserve it. I nodded, unsure of what to say. I'm glad you're doing better, Jane. I am, she said, smiling. I've been in therapy, and I'm starting to put my life back together. I've also found a job and am living on my own now. That's good to hear, I replied, genuinely happy for her. Jane took a deep breath. I know I've caused you a lot of pain, and I'm sorry. I've come to terms with what I did, and I'm working on becoming a better person. I just wanted you to know that. I appreciated her honesty. Thank you, Jane. I wish you all the best. She nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. Take care, John. With that, she left, and I felt a sense of closure. It was like the final piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. Jane was on her own path to recovery, and I could fully focus on my family and the life Emily and I were building together. Emily and I continued to raise Grace in a loving and supportive environment. We made sure to cherish every moment, knowing how precious life is. The past had been filled with turmoil, but it had also taught us resilience and the importance of love and forgiveness. As I look back on everything that happened, I'm grateful for the lessons learned and the strength we gained. Emily and I are stronger than ever, and Grace is growing up in a home filled with love and security. We've built a life that we're proud of, and I know that no matter what challenges come our way, we can face them together. Thank you, Reddit, for being there through this journey. Your support and advice have meant the world to me. Here's to new beginnings and the hope that the future holds. This is John, signing off from this saga. Take care, everyone.